November 5th, 2014. Sullivan, Indiana, a small town that could easily be overlooked, its streets lined with modest homes and the scent of autumn leaves in the air. A place where the unexpected rarely happens, and life moves at a pace set by the seasons. But in this quiet town, one seemingly normal day would soon turn into the beginning of a case that would shake its very foundation. Tiffany Adams, 20 years old and 8 months pregnant, went missing without a trace. Her disappearance, though seemingly minor at first, would soon evolve into something far darker. It was a day like any other when she last spoke to her family. She had made plans to visit her mother, but she never arrived. The last known communication was a brief text message, after which her phone went silent. Her car, however, remained parked in front of her father's house, with no signs of forced entry or a struggle. For the people who knew Tiffany, this was a puzzling event. She was not the type to disappear voluntarily. She had a family, a baby on the way, and a life that she had been looking forward to. But as hours turned to days, and then weeks, it became clear. This was no ordinary disappearance. Something was terribly wrong. The investigation began quickly. Local authorities, followed by state police, started by interviewing family and friends. No one had heard from Tiffany, and her family was at a loss. Her father, Bruce Adams, and her mother, Christina, couldn't comprehend why their daughter would leave. There was no indication of any trouble in her life, no apparent enemies. However, as investigators began to dig deeper, they uncovered something unsettling. Tiffany had a strained relationship with her stepbrother, Jonas Orr. Jonas, who had been part of her life for years, became a central figure in the investigation. Tiffany had previously accused him of sexual assault in 2013. Though the allegations had not led to criminal charges at the time, they were a crucial part of her history with him. There was tension between them, and investigators were beginning to wonder if that was the key to understanding her disappearance. The police began their routine process of interviews and gathering information, but it was soon apparent that the story being pieced together didn't quite add up. Tiffany's family told investigators that she had been excited about the baby and that nothing seemed unusual about her plans on the day she vanished. But there was a feeling, a subtle sense of unease that lingered in the air. Why had she not made it to her mother's house? Why hadn't anyone seen her in the days leading up to her disappearance? Despite these questions, there were no immediate answers. Surveillance footage from local cameras didn't show her leaving her father's house. Her phone records showed that she had contacted her stepbrother that day. But after that, everything went dark. It wasn't long before the case turned cold, with no solid leads to follow. But in small towns, things often aren't as simple as they seem. As the investigation continued, it began to stretch further and further into uncharted territory. The initial hours of a missing person investigation might be routine, but as every passing day brought no answers, the situation began to feel more like a crime scene than a missing persons case. Then on December 30th, 2014, 55 days after Tiffany's disappearance, a breakthrough came in the form of a discovery in a cornfield just outside Sullivan. A farmer walking his fields found a body. The remains were later confirmed to be Tiffany's. Her identity was unmistakable, and the manner of death was anything but natural. An autopsy revealed that Tiffany had been strangled with her own red jacket, a chilling detail that would send shockwaves through her family and the community. But the most haunting part of this discovery was that her unborn child, her baby, a daughter she had planned to bring into the world, had not survived. The cause of death was clear: strangulation. But what remained unclear was why she was taken from this world in such a violent and senseless manner. The initial sense of loss and confusion soon gave way to something darker. Authorities had now identified a crime, but it wasn't just any crime, it was a murder, and the evidence was beginning to stack up bit by bit. Jonas Orr, Tiffany's stepbrother, was immediately brought in for questioning. His initial responses were measured, even casual. But as investigators pressed him, a pattern of behavior began to emerge. He was evasive, and certain details didn't add up. Surveillance footage placed his vehicle in the vicinity of the cornfield, where Tiffany's body was found on the night she went missing. His alibi, which initially seemed solid, began to unravel with every question that was asked. At this stage, detectives still couldn't be certain. The pieces were there, But the full picture had yet to form, and it was becoming clear that whoever had committed this crime had not only left physical evidence behind, but had also left a trail of digital footprints, calls, messages, and a series of incriminating actions that were starting to paint a picture of something far more sinister. The case, once a missing person report, was now a homicide investigation. A simple phone call, a series of questions about where Tiffany had gone, had set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. The discovery of Tiffany Adams' body had shifted the investigation into a new and unsettling direction. It was no longer about a missing person. This was a homicide, and the pressure to uncover the truth weighed heavily on the shoulders of those investigating the case. The small town of Sullivan had become a place of quiet suspicion. What started as a tragedy in a quiet community was now becoming a deep mystery, unraveling in ways no one could have predicted. As the initial shock of the discovery faded, the investigation began to focus on the facts. The autopsy report confirmed the obvious. Tiffany had been strangled. Her cause of death was listed as asphyxiation due to strangulation with her own red jacket. The gruesome detail, her unborn child, a daughter she had been eagerly preparing for, had also died. This wasn't just the murder of a young woman. This was the murder of a mother, and the crime had claimed the life of an innocent child. The cold reality of the situation began to set in. There was no denying it now. Someone had done this. At this point, authorities turned their attention to the family and the people closest to Tiffany. The question was no longer just about who could have done this. It was about who had the motive, who had the opportunity, and who could have executed such a chilling act. Jonas Orr, Tiffany's stepbrother, immediately came under suspicion. His name had come up early in the investigation when it was revealed that Tiffany had previously accused him of sexual assault in 2013. While no charges were ever filed, the mere existence of this allegation was enough to draw attention. Investigators knew they had to look closer at his movements, his interactions, and most importantly, the evidence that could tie him to Tiffany's murder. The first crucial piece of evidence came from a routine examination of Tiffany's phone records. Investigators discovered that her last known communication had been with Jonas, a phone call made at 2:45 p.m. on November 5th, just hours before she was last seen. The call lasted for a minute. The content of the conversation was not known, as the call was not recorded, but it was enough to raise further suspicions. What came next was even more revealing. Tiffany's phone had been powered off after that call. This wasn't unusual in itself, but the investigators quickly realized that it could mean something more. Why would she turn off her phone right after speaking with Jonas? Had she been planning something that required her to disconnect from the outside world? Or was it more likely that she had been silenced, her last known connection severed intentionally? A search of Jonas's phone records revealed another disturbing detail. He had been near the area where Tiffany's body was found on the night she went missing. Surveillance footage from local cameras had caught a glimpse of his vehicle leaving the vicinity of the cornfield, where Tiffany's body was discovered 55 days later. The timestamp of the footage matched the time frame when the murder was believed to have taken place. Jonas's alibi was shaky. He claimed that he had been at home that evening, watching television. But when questioned about the surveillance footage, he became evasive. He didn't seem to have a reasonable explanation for why his vehicle was in the exact location where Tiffany's body had been dumped. It was a glaring inconsistency, one that could not be ignored. With every new revelation, the investigators' confidence in their case grew. The physical evidence, Tiffany's phone records, the surveillance footage, and Jonas's questionable alibi painted a clear picture. Jonas was becoming the prime suspect, but there was still one critical question that needed to be answered. What had driven him to commit such an act? The investigators were determined to find out. They began to dig deeper into Jonas's background. What they uncovered was both disturbing and revealing. Jonas had a history of anger issues, and his relationship with Tiffany had never been straightforward. She had described him as controlling, even manipulative at times, and their interactions had often been strained. More importantly, it became clear that Jonas had never truly accepted Tiffany's pregnancy. When Tiffany had revealed her plans to raise the baby, Jonas had become increasingly agitated. There were reports from family members who said he had made passive-aggressive comments about the baby, expressing his distaste for the idea of becoming an uncle. But those were just words, words that didn't seem threatening until you considered them in the context of the murder. The deeper the investigation went, the more it became evident that Jonas had not only the opportunity, but also the motive. The timeline of the murder, the phone records, the surveillance footage, all of it pointed toward him. Still, investigators knew they needed more to bring the case to a close. As they continued to piece together the forensic evidence, they uncovered yet another key discovery: a partial fingerprint found on the red jacket that had been used to strangle Tiffany. The print, though partial, was a match to Jonas. It was a piece of physical evidence that could not be explained away. The jacket had been the murder weapon, and his fingerprint was on it. This discovery was the final piece that locked Jonas in as the prime suspect. The initial shock of Tiffany Adams' death had set in, but the investigation into her murder was far from over. The discovery of her body in a cornfield had been a critical turning point, but with it came more questions than answers. As the investigation progressed, the physical evidence began to stack up in ways that would ultimately reveal the truth. What had started as a missing persons case had now become a murder investigation with increasingly damning evidence. The first crucial lead was a fingerprint found on Tiffany's red jacket, the very jacket that had been used to strangle her. The forensic team had analyzed the jacket carefully, searching for traces of DNA or other materials that might provide further insight into what had happened in those final moments. It was during this analysis that the fingerprint was discovered. Though it was partial, it was enough to provide a solid lead. Jonas Orr's fingerprint matched the one found on the jacket. This was not the first piece of evidence to tie Jonas to the murder, but it was the one that could not be explained away. It was a cold, undeniable piece of forensic evidence that directly linked him to the scene of the crime. In the world of criminal investigations, a fingerprint left on the victim's clothing is a strong indicator of involvement. Forensic specialists understood its significance. This was the sort of evidence that was difficult to refute. But the fingerprint was just one part of the puzzle. Investigators knew they had to build a case using all available evidence, not just one isolated piece. To do so, they needed to trace Jonas's movements on the night of Tiffany's disappearance. It was here that digital forensics became crucial. The police obtained Jonas's cell phone records and began to cross-reference them with the times and locations where Tiffany had been last seen. What they uncovered was a series of calls and messages that painted an increasingly troubling picture. Tiffany's phone had last been active just after a call to Jonas. It was clear that they had been in contact just hours before her disappearance, but there was more. Records showed that after her phone went silent, Jonas's phone had been active in the area around the cornfield, where Tiffany's body would later be discovered. This couldn't be coincidence. There was more. GPS data from Jonas's phone confirmed that he had been near the location at the exact time the murder was believed to have occurred. The timestamps lined up with the footage from local surveillance cameras showing his vehicle passing through the area. This evidence was airtight. It placed Jonas at the scene, not as an innocent bystander, but as someone with direct involvement in the events leading up to Tiffany's death. Despite this mounting evidence, Jonas continued to deny any wrongdoing. His alibi seemed flimsy at best. He had claimed to have been at home, watching television, when Tiffany disappeared. However, his own movements contradicted this story. His phone's GPS data and the surveillance footage made it clear that he had been in the vicinity of the crime scene during the critical hours. The investigators had now built a timeline, and it was difficult for Jonas to explain away the sequence of events. But they needed more. They needed to understand why he had killed Tiffany. What was his motive? The answer lay in the strained relationship between Jonas and Tiffany. Their history was filled with tension, a dynamic that had been apparent to those close to them. Tiffany had always felt uncomfortable around Jonas, especially after the sexual assault allegations in 2013. Though the case had not resulted in any charges, it was clear that their relationship had never fully recovered. Tiffany had distanced herself from him, and this estrangement had created a rift in the family. Jonas's behavior had grown increasingly erratic in the months leading up to Tiffany's death. His resentment toward her was palpable. Tiffany had been moving forward with her life, preparing to become a mother, and this seemed to anger him. He made it clear in conversations with family members that he didn't want Tiffany's baby to become a part of his life. This anger, combined with his feelings of entitlement and control, had festered into something far more dangerous. In the weeks before her murder, Tiffany had spoken to her mother about her concerns regarding Jonas. She had said that she felt uneasy around him, that his behavior was unpredictable. Yet her mother, like many others, had brushed it off as familial tension, something that could be reconciled over time. But now, in light of the evidence, it became clear that those concerns were valid. Jonas had not been acting out of simple frustration. He had been motivated by something deeper: jealousy, control, and a twisted sense of entitlement. Jonas's anger had likely boiled over the day Tiffany went missing. The final confrontation had taken place shortly before she disappeared. It was a moment of uncontrolled rage, one that culminated in her murder. The strangulation with her own jacket was not a crime of impulse. It was deliberate, calculated, and brutal. As the investigation continued, the authorities grew more certain of their theory. Jonas was the prime suspect, and the evidence supporting his guilt was overwhelming. His fingerprint on the jacket, his phone records, and his GPS data all pointed to him. But there was one last question to answer. Would he confess to his crime? As the investigation into Tiffany Adams' murder progressed, the evidence against Jonas Orr grew more concrete. The forensic findings, the fingerprint on Tiffany's jacket, the GPS data linking Jonas to the area of the crime scene, the shaky alibi, all pointed directly to him. However, what remained elusive was the motive. What could have driven someone to kill a woman so violently, especially someone so close to him? That question had lingered in the minds of investigators as they worked tirelessly to piece together the final details of the case. Jonas had remained quiet for days, offering little to no new information. His initial statements were vague, and as the pressure mounted, his story began to fall apart. It wasn't just the physical evidence. It was the way his actions and words didn't align. Investigators could no longer rely on his explanations. They needed to understand more about Jonas's relationship with Tiffany, the emotional context that might explain why he had taken her life. They started by speaking to more people who had been close to both Tiffany and Jonas. What they learned painted a troubling picture. Tiffany's family members were interviewed again, this time with a focus on the history between the victim and her stepbrother. It wasn't just about the one accusation of sexual assault from 2013. There was a pattern of behavior that had emerged. Jonas had always been controlling, manipulative even, and Tiffany had become increasingly distant from him. In fact, she had expressed her discomfort with him to her family in the days leading up to her disappearance. Tiffany had told her mother that she felt uneasy whenever she was around Jonas. It wasn't something she could explain easily, but it was enough to raise red flags. More witnesses came forward, each revealing snippets of information that added to the growing picture of Jonas as a deeply troubled individual. His outbursts, his jealousy, his inability to accept Tiffany's growing independence, it all pointed to a simmering anger. But it wasn't just that he was angry. He was also deeply resentful. He resented that Tiffany was moving on with her life, especially with her pregnancy. Jonas had never been supportive of the idea of Tiffany becoming a mother, and those feelings, however subtle, had festered. Investigators soon learned that Jonas's anger had not been limited to Tiffany's pregnancy. There were disturbing reports from family members about his behavior. He had expressed, in moments of tension, that he didn't want Tiffany's baby to be a part of his life. Those comments, once dismissed as nothing more than sibling frustration, now seemed more significant. It was clear that Jonas had been struggling with emotions that were far from healthy. His resentment had been growing, and investigators believed that Tiffany had been the target of that growing frustration. By now, the pattern was undeniable. Jonas had motive, opportunity, and the means to commit the murder. But there was still one element that remained unanswered. How did he go from passive aggression and resentment to actually killing his stepsister? What triggered that final, deadly act? The turning point came when investigators revisited the crime scene. They needed to understand how the murder had been carried out, the circumstances of Tiffany's final moments, the location of the body, the positioning of the jacket used for strangulation, the evidence of a struggle, all pointed to a brutal, intentional act. The red jacket, Tiffany's own clothing, had been used against her. She had fought back, but ultimately, it had been her own jacket that ended her life. It was an act of rage, and as investigators pieced together the details, they could almost visualize the events that unfolded that day. The location of the body also spoke volumes. It wasn't random. It was calculated. The cornfield, remote and isolated, was an ideal place for someone trying to hide a crime. Jonas had not simply been in the area when the murder took place. He had deliberately disposed of Tiffany's body there, knowing that it would take time before anyone would find it. The use of the cornfield as a dumping ground was a chilling indication of premeditation. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was cold, calculated, and planned. By now, the weight of the evidence against Jonas was undeniable, but there was still one key element missing: his confession. Investigators knew that they had the facts, but they needed Jonas to admit his guilt. They needed him to speak, to explain why he had killed his stepsister. Without that confession, they would only have circumstantial evidence, no matter how strong. Jonas had become a man on the edge. The more investigators pushed, the more his facade began to crack. It wasn't long before he began to slip, offering up small details that contradicted his earlier statements. At times his anger was palpable, but at other moments he was almost eerily calm. The shifting emotions reflected the internal turmoil he was experiencing. As investigators confronted him with the evidence, it was clear that Jonas was running out of places to hide. But the question remained: would he confess, or would he continue to deny everything? By now, the evidence against Jonas Orr had grown overwhelming. Investigators had methodically connected the dots, piecing together the timeline and facts surrounding Tiffany Adams' murder. The forensic evidence, including the fingerprint found on her red jacket and the digital data confirming Jonas's location, had provided a solid foundation for the case. But despite the mounting evidence, one question remained. Would Jonas confess to the crime? His demeanor had begun to shift. In the early days of the investigation, Jonas had been confident, almost dismissive. But as time wore on and the weight of the evidence grew heavier, cracks began to appear in his carefully constructed narrative. He could no longer deny the facts. His alibi had been proven false, his phone records contradicted his statements, and his fingerprints were on the murder weapon. Yet despite all of this, Jonas refused to admit guilt. The pressure was building, not just from the investigators, but from his own internal conflict. He had been caught in lie after lie, and now he found himself at a crossroads. The investigators knew this was the breaking point. He couldn't keep up the facade forever. It wasn't until the detectives confronted him with the specifics of the evidence that he started to falter. The physical evidence, the fingerprint, the phone records, the GPS data, was undeniable. But there was something more. The emotional aspect of the case. The investigators pressed Jonas on his relationship with Tiffany, forcing him to confront the past. They didn't accuse him outright at first. They let him tell his side of the story. They let him explain how things had been between him and Tiffany leading up to her death. But as he spoke, his own words began to reveal his guilt. Jonas's anger, his resentment toward her pregnancy, and his growing detachment from her were evident in every sentence he uttered. He wasn't just talking about Tiffany as if she were a person. He spoke of her as an obstacle in his life. The bitterness and jealousy that had festered in him over time became clear. For weeks, Tiffany had been moving forward with her life. She was preparing to become a mother, something Jonas had never been able to accept. He had expressed frustration over the pregnancy to others in the family, making comments that now seemed far more sinister. In Jonas's mind, Tiffany's choices were a direct threat to the world he had imagined for himself. As the tension between them increased, it was only a matter of time before his anger boiled over into violence. As investigators pushed him further, his defenses crumbled. He began to admit that the situation with Tiffany had become unbearable for him. He felt that she was leaving him behind, taking a new path that didn't involve him. He resented her for it. The very baby she was carrying, the one thing that had been her hope for the future, had become a symbol of everything he hated. The deeper they dug, the more they realized that this was not a spontaneous act of rage. It had been building up for months. He had seen Tiffany as a threat to his own existence, and in his twisted view, eliminating her was the only way to regain control. The confession came not in a moment of dramatic revelation, but rather in a slow unraveling of his psyche. As he admitted to being the last person to see Tiffany alive, and as he spoke about the animosity he felt toward her, the investigators knew they had their man. The evidence had spoken for itself, but hearing it from Jonas's own mouth sealed the deal. With his confession, the case seemed to be reaching its final stage. The detectives, however, were not done yet. They had to ensure that every piece of the puzzle was accounted for. They asked him to walk them through the night of the murder to explain exactly what had happened. Jonas's account was chillingly detailed, revealing that he had deliberately planned the murder. It was not an act of passion, but one of cold calculation. He had lured Tiffany into a confrontation, and when she became upset, he used her own jacket to strangle her. The location where he disposed of her body, the cornfield, was not random. He knew the area well. He had carefully chosen it, understanding that it would take days, if not weeks, before anyone found her. It was a calculated decision, one that demonstrated his willingness to hide the crime at any cost. With Jonas Orr's confession, the investigation had reached its most crucial stage. The overwhelming evidence, a combination of physical, digital, and forensic data, had sealed his fate. The confession itself, delivered in the face of undeniable proof, left little room for doubt. But even with the case so clearly pointing toward Jonas as the perpetrator, the real battle had only just begun. This was not merely about proving his guilt, it was about securing justice, ensuring that Tiffany Adams and her unborn child would not have died in vain. The legal proceedings were set into motion quickly. Jonas was formally charged with first-degree murder and fetal homicide. His trial would determine whether he would spend the rest of his life in prison or face a lighter sentence. The stakes were high, not just for Jonas, but for his family, who had been forced to confront the horrifying truth about their son and brother. Tiffany's family, too, was left with the painful task of watching the system grind its way through the motions of justice. But for them, the trial was not just a legal process, it was a painful reckoning, a final chapter to a tragedy that had shaken them to their core. The prosecution team wasted no time in preparing their case. Their focus was clear. They would demonstrate that the murder was premeditated, that Jonas had acted with malice and deliberate intent. The evidence was solid, but the prosecutors knew that Jonas's defense attorneys would attempt to exploit any possible gaps in the narrative. His confession would be crucial, but it wasn't enough on its own. The prosecution needed to reinforce their case with a combination of physical evidence, expert testimony, and witness statements. One of the most critical pieces of evidence was the autopsy report. Tiffany's cause of death, as established in Chapter 3, was strangulation, specifically by her own red jacket. The forensic team had concluded that the manner of death was deliberate, not spontaneous. The position of the body, the absence of defensive wounds on her hands and arms, suggested that she had been taken by surprise and perhaps manipulated into a vulnerable position. This reinforced the prosecution's argument that the murder had been premeditated. Jonas had carefully planned this out. There had been no immediate rush to kill her, no spur-of-the-moment violence. Instead, it had been cold, calculated. In addition to the autopsy, forensic experts would testify about the evidence found at the scene of the crime. The location of the body, buried in a remote cornfield, was no accident. It was a strategic choice, made with the intent to delay discovery and make the crime more difficult to trace. The cornfield had offered the perfect cover, a remote and desolate location where Jonas could safely dispose of the body, confident that it would take time before anyone would stumble upon the scene. The GPS and cell phone data were also integral to the case. Investigators had used this data to prove that Jonas had been near the location where Tiffany's body was found. The cell phone logs showed that he had been in the area at the exact time that the murder was believed to have occurred. This, combined with the surveillance footage from nearby cameras, painted a damning picture. Jonas's vehicle was seen on tape leaving the area shortly after the time of the crime, confirming the investigators' suspicions that he had been the one to dispose of the body. Despite the weight of the evidence, Jonas's defense team maintained a strategy of trying to discredit the prosecution's case. They attempted to argue that the confession had been coerced, that Jonas had not been in the right frame of mind when he admitted to the crime. But this defense didn't hold up under scrutiny. The evidence against him was not just circumstantial, it was irrefutable. His confession, given voluntarily and corroborated by physical evidence, stood as the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. As the trial continued, the emotional toll on both families became increasingly evident. For Tiffany's family, this was not just a legal process, it was an emotional journey, a necessary but painful step toward justice. They listened as the prosecution laid out their case, detailing the tragic circumstances of Tiffany's death and the profound loss her family had experienced. They had to relive the horror of their daughter's murder, hearing the details of how she had been killed and discarded like an object. Jonas's family, on the other hand, was faced with a different kind of pain. The knowledge that their son, their brother, was capable of such a crime was a burden that they could not escape. There were no easy answers, no way to rationalize what had happened. They had to face the truth, that Jonas had taken the life of someone who had once been part of their family. In the courtroom, Jonas remained silent, his face betraying little emotion. His coldness only added to the sense of finality to the proceedings. The prosecution was methodical in its approach. The key point was clear. Jonas had murdered Tiffany and her unborn child in a calculated, premeditated act. The evidence tied him directly to the crime, and there was no reasonable doubt left in the minds of the investigators or the prosecution team. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed into their seats, the weight of the case settling in on all present. Tiffany Adams' murder, a brutal crime that had shaken the small town of Sullivan, Indiana, was now in the hands of 12 individuals whose decision would determine the future of Jonas Orr. The prosecutor's office had presented a compelling case, solid forensic evidence, including fingerprints, phone records, GPS data, and Jonas's confession. Each piece of the puzzle fell into place, painting a chilling picture of premeditated murder. But now it was time for the jury to decide. Throughout the trial, the defense team had fought tooth and nail to cast doubt on the case. They argued that Jonas's confession had been coerced, that the pressure from law enforcement had led him to admit guilt under duress. Their strategy was clear. They needed to discredit the prosecution's evidence and create just enough reasonable doubt to sway the jury in their favor. But the truth, as presented through the meticulous investigation, was undeniable. The evidence was overwhelming, and as the closing arguments came to a close, there was little left for the defense to hold on to. The prosecutor, unwavering and determined, emphasized the cold and calculated nature of the crime. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision driven by anger. No, this was the result of months, if not years, of resentment, jealousy, and manipulation. Tiffany had become a target because she had something Jonas could not accept: a future, a family, a life moving forward while his own remained stagnant. The prosecutor reminded the jury that Jonas's actions had robbed not only Tiffany of her future, but also her unborn child. The loss was irreparable. Jonas sat in the defendant's chair, his face impassive. His emotions remained hidden, though his body language suggested a man who was trapped in the corner. His earlier bravado had dissipated, replaced by the quiet resignation of someone who knew the inevitable was coming. Despite his confession, there was still a sense of disbelief in the room that someone so close to Tiffany could be capable of such violence. The defense team presented their closing argument. They pointed to the lack of concrete forensic evidence directly linking Jonas to the act of murder. The fingerprint on Tiffany's jacket was one piece of evidence, but could it alone be enough to secure a conviction for first-degree murder? They suggested that Jonas, under extreme emotional distress, might have been pressured into a confession he didn't fully understand the consequences of. They painted a picture of a man who had lost control in a moment of weakness, rather than a calculated murderer. Despite their best efforts, the defense's argument seemed to fall flat. The facts were stark, the timeline was clear, and the forensic evidence was solid. Even Jonas's own words in his confession spoke volumes about the premeditated nature of the crime. This was no accident. This was the culmination of a long-held resentment. The jury deliberated for hours, though it was clear that the case had already been decided in their minds. There was no need for long discussions or arguments. The evidence had spoken for itself. When the jury finally returned to the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. The foreman stood holding the verdict in his hand. "Guilty," he said, his voice clear and firm, "on both counts." The courtroom exhaled collectively. The tension that had gripped everyone for weeks, even months, had finally been released. Jonas was led away in handcuffs, his future sealed. He had murdered his stepsister Tiffany and her unborn child, and now he would face the consequences of his actions. For Tiffany's family, the verdict was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the pain of losing their daughter and grandchild could never be undone. They had to live with the reality that someone they had once trusted, someone they had shared family gatherings and holidays with, was capable of such a horrific act. The emotional toll on them was profound, and while the conviction brought a sense of closure, it could not heal the wound left by the tragedy. Jonas's family, meanwhile, sat in stunned silence. The knowledge that their son and brother had committed such an unforgivable act was a burden they would carry for the rest of their lives. No amount of legal proceedings or public trial could change the fact that they had lost a family member. 2. Not through death, but through the destruction of the life they once knew. As the judge read Jonas's sentence, 120 years in prison without the possibility of parole, the finality of it all settled in. The family of Tiffany Adams could begin to move forward, but the memory of what had been lost would linger forever. Justice had been served, but it had come at a high cost. The conviction of Jonas Orr brought a semblance of closure, but the damage done to the Adams family was irreparable. Sentenced to 120 years in prison, Jonas would never be free again. But for Tiffany's parents, Bruce and Christina, and her extended family, the true sentence was the loss of a daughter, a sister, and a future that would never come to pass. As the legal proceedings wrapped up, the weight of the case began to settle on the small town of Sullivan. What had once been a community bound by familiarity and shared history was now divided. Neighbors who had known Jonas for years found themselves in disbelief, struggling to reconcile the man they once considered part of their community with the monster revealed in court. The town would never be the same again, just as Tiffany's family would never fully recover. For Tiffany's family, the aftermath was painful, but marked by a desire for something more, something meaningful to come from the tragedy. They decided to establish a foundation in Tiffany's name, dedicated to raising awareness about domestic violence and the importance of protecting vulnerable individuals from family-related violence. Their mission was simple: to ensure that no one else would have to endure what Tiffany and her unborn child had. Jonas, locked away in a facility far from Sullivan, had little to offer in the way of remorse. His confession, though undeniably impactful, did little to alleviate the grief he had caused. His family, too, was left to pick up the pieces. They had to live with the knowledge that their loved one was capable of taking the life of someone they had once considered part of their own. Their world, too, had been shattered, but the pain of his actions could never be erased. The investigation into Tiffany's murder had been thorough. In the trial, a necessary form of justice, but the ultimate consequence was the loss of life. The young life of a woman who had been filled with promise and the potential to make a lasting impact. In the end, the legal system had done its job, but no verdict could bring back Tiffany or undo the ripple effect her death had on so many people. As the years passed, Sullivan slowly moved on, but the legacy of Tiffany's story remained. Her murder had been the catalyst for change in the community, one that forced people to confront the uncomfortable truth that the darkest acts can come from within the most familiar circles. It was a sobering reminder that justice, though necessary, can never truly erase the pain caused by loss. Tiffany Adams may be gone, but her memory would not be forgotten. As we wrap up this heartbreaking case, it's important to remember that justice isn't just about the verdict, but about the lessons we take with us. Tiffany's story is a reminder that we must always be vigilant, listen to the voices of those around us, and never ignore signs of harm, even when they come from within our own families. It's a call for stronger communities, for recognizing when someone needs help, and for standing up for what's right. The road to healing is long, but through awareness and education, we can prevent these tragedies. So I ask you, what can we do today to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else? What role can we each play in building a safer, more supportive world for all? If you found this video meaningful, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts or let me know where you're watching from. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on more real stories that matter. Thank you for being here, and let's continue the conversation.